a move that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in a matter of hours. Hours that changed the security posture of Eastern Europe. Hours that triggered emergency consultations in Brussels. Hours that forced Poland to activate defense protocols not seen since the Cold War. What Moscow did last night crossed a line that the Atlantic Alliance had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Warsaw did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with force, and with unmistakable resolve. The midnight hour in Europe has never felt darker, but the response from NATO's eastern flank has never been more illuminated. This is the story of what happened when Russia moved, when Brussels warned, and when Poland answered. For several months now, there had been signals, not official statements from the Kremlin, not formal declarations from the Russian Ministry of Defense, just signals that Moscow was preparing something unprecedented along the Suwalki Gap. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a formula. Military exercises announced weeks in advance, troop rotations that follow seasonal patterns, rhetoric that escalates and de-escalates with diplomatic calendars. But what set off alarm bells in Brussels this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military activity know the indicators: the sudden cessation of electronic communications, the repositioning of mobile command units, the movement of logistics trains toward Belarus, the sudden absence of commercial flights over certain corridors. All of that went quiet. And whenever Moscow goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Western satellites had been tracking unusual activity near the Belarusian border for the past 72 hours. Encrypted communications between Russian Western Military District Command and Minsk spiked by 400%. Ground-penetrating radar detected what appeared to be the construction of forward ammunition depots, the kind that aren't built for exercises, they're built for operations. NATO Supreme Allied Commander General Christopher Cavoli had already elevated the alliance's readiness posture twice this month. Both times the elevations were described as precautionary, but tonight there was nothing precautionary about what happened next. Early this morning, NATO's Allied Air Command detected what they described as a significant repositioning of Russian strategic assets, including S-400 missile systems that had not been deployed to the Kaliningrad exclave in over 18 months. These are the kinds of systems that Moscow only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: territorial defense, offensive preparation, or strategic intimidation. Allied commanders didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing its military posture along NATO's most vulnerable corridor. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by a single battalion, the entire alliance pays attention. The Suwalki Gap, a 65-mile stretch of land connecting Poland to Lithuania, has long been considered the most strategically vulnerable point in NATO's eastern defense. If Russia were to seize it, the Baltic states would be cut off from the rest of the alliance. Tonight, that nightmare scenario moved one step closer to reality. Russian forces, operating under the cover of what Moscow called routine defensive measures, had positioned themselves within striking distance of that corridor, and they had done so at midnight, when diplomatic channels are slowest to respond. The warning issued by Brussels tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. NATO spokesperson Oana Lungescu, speaking after an emergency meeting of the North Atlantic Council, described Russia's move as provocative, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, inconsistent with any legitimate defensive purpose. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Poland did not. In fact, their response today was among the fastest and most comprehensive we've seen in modern European defense history. Here's what we know. Within 4 hours of detecting Russian repositioning, Warsaw activated its territorial defense forces across 3 eastern provinces. These weren't the reserve units typically called up for annual exercises. These were frontline combat brigades, armored divisions equipped with Leopard 2 tanks, K2 Black Panthers, and HIMARS rocket artillery systems that Poland only deploys when they are preparing to defend sovereign territory. Polish Defense Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz appeared on national television at 6 o'clock this morning, Warsaw time. His message was direct. Poland will not be intimidated. Poland will not be surprised. And Poland will not stand alone. Within the hour, German Bundeswehr units stationed in Lithuania began moving toward the Polish border under NATO coordination protocols. American F-35s stationed at Wask Air Base were placed on elevated alert status, and British Royal Marines, already deployed to Estonia as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence, received orders to extend their deployment indefinitely. Tonight, Polish military command confirmed that Warsaw launched immediate reinforcement operations on defensive positions along the Suwalki corridor. including forward operating bases that had recently been expanded for what analysts believe was precisely this scenario. Poland moved armor forward before Russia could consolidate its repositioned forces. They reinforced position Alpha 7 near Augusto. They reinforced position Bravo 3 outside Suwalki. They reinforced mobile artillery units that were likely preparing to provide fire support for any defensive engagement. In other words, Poland targeted the exact geographic choke points that Russia would need to control in any corridor seizure operation. The logistics infrastructure that would have made a Russian advance operational. This is what made Brussels' warning so urgent. Russia's midnight move wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of repositioning that could enable a fait accompli operation if left unchecked. And Poland, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't mass troops in ways that could be misinterpreted as offensive. They didn't issue inflammatory rhetoric that could escalate beyond control. They hit defensive positions with precision. They hit logistics nodes with purpose. The message was unmistakable. Any advance would be met with immediate, overwhelming resistance. Polish Chief of the General Staff, General Wisław Kukua, told reporters this evening that his forces could sustain defensive operations for as long as necessary. He noted that Poland's military spending, now exceeding 4% of GDP, the highest in NATO, had been preparing for exactly this moment. We did not invest in our military to watch from the sidelines, he said. We invested to defend. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence agencies now believe that Russia's latest move was designed to test the cohesion of NATO's eastern response after months of political uncertainty in Washington. Moscow wanted to see whether the alliance would fracture under pressure, but instead the opposite happened. Poland didn't wait for consensus. They launched a response that was so immediate, so coordinated that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, Warsaw did. Defense analysts speaking with European media under anonymity described Russia's repositioning as probing, a way to assess NATO's reaction time and commitment to Article 5 guarantees. But Poland proved today that they remain both capable and willing. Their defensive deployments were not only rapid, they were calibrated so precisely that Russian reconnaissance assets were unable to establish clear targeting data. That element matters because it shows operational sophistication. It shows that Poland is not merely a tripwire for American intervention. They are a frontline defender in their own right. General Ben Hodges, former commander of U.S. Army Europe, told reporters tonight that Poland's response exceeded what many NATO planners had projected. This wasn't a symbolic gesture, Hodges said. This was a military response designed to impose immediate costs on any aggressor. Poland has become the most combat-ready nation on NATO's eastern flank, and tonight they proved it. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of NATO's collective response. German armored units carried out rapid repositioning to forward bases in Lithuania, forcing Russian planners to account for a second axis of reinforcement. American F-35 fighter jets targeted patrol routes over the Baltic Sea that had been increased by Russian naval aviation in the last 48 hours. British cyber operations units operating from undisclosed locations reportedly disrupted communication networks used by Russian forces to coordinate their midnight repositioning. This wasn't just national defense. This wasn't just alliance coordination. This was integrated deterrence. This was collective resolve. And collective resolve is the one thing Moscow has struggled to overcome since the invasion of Ukraine began. For every territorial advance Russia has made in Ukraine, NATO has countered with something that complicates Moscow's strategic calculations. More troops forward deployed, more weapons systems transferred, more nations joining the alliance, more defense budgets expanding. Tonight was simply the latest chapter in that ongoing recalibration. Remember, Russia thought NATO would fracture over Ukraine. They thought European energy dependence would prevent meaningful sanctions. They thought Poland and the Baltic states would eventually accommodate Russian demands rather than risk confrontation. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. NATO is more unified than at any point since the Cold War. European energy independence from Russia has accelerated beyond projections. Poland has become the most heavily armed nation on the continent relative to its size. The assumptions that underpinned Russian strategy have collapsed one by one. And yet Moscow continues to probe. Why? Because the Kremlin believes that time is on their side. They believe that Western democracies eventually lose focus. They believe that defense spending will decline, that political coalitions will shift. that public attention will wander. Tonight's response was designed to disabuse them of that notion. What makes this moment so dangerous and so consequential is that Russia's latest move happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under extraordinary internal pressure. Hardliners want more aggressive action against NATO. Military commanders want resources diverted from Ukraine. Economic ministers want sanctions relief through diplomatic breakthroughs. Security services want to demonstrate that Russia remains a great power. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a war that has lasted far longer and cost far more than anyone in Moscow projected. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The midnight repositioning wasn't a sign of Russian confidence. It was a sign of Russian anxiety. Moscow is watching NATO's eastern buildup with growing concern. They see Poland's military transformation. They see Finnish and Swedish integration into the alliance. They see American long-range precision weapons being positioned within striking distance of Russian territory. Tonight's move was an attempt to regain the initiative, but it backfired. NATO's formal statement, now distributed to all member governments and international media, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to accept Russian coercion along its borders. Secretary General Mark Rutte said plainly that Russia's midnight repositioning was inconsistent with the principles of European security and the commitments Moscow has repeatedly made. That is diplomatic language for we see what you're doing and we will not tolerate it. You don't usually hear that tone from Brussels unless something serious is at stake. The statement went further, invoking language from the Washington Treaty itself, language that reminds all parties that an attack on one is an attack on all. Article 5 wasn't explicitly invoked tonight, but it was unmistakably referenced, and that reference carries weight that Moscow cannot ignore. Meanwhile, Poland's President Andrzej Duda addressed his nation in a somber, resolute speech tonight. He said, "Poland has faced threats before. We have faced occupation before. We have faced attempts to erase us from the map before. We are still here." He said, "Tonight our forces stand ready, not because we seek conflict, but because we refuse to be victims of it." And he said, "To our allies, we are grateful. To our adversaries, we are prepared. To our citizens, we are vigilant." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Poland lost 6 million citizens in World War II. They endured decades of Soviet domination. They remember what happens when aggression goes unchallenged. Tonight, they made clear that history will not repeat itself. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's latest repositioning wasn't isolated. Along with the S-400 deployments to Kaliningrad, Belarusian forces also conducted unexpected exercises near the Polish border. Russian Baltic Fleet vessels departed Baltijsk Naval Base under unusual operational security. Russian cyber operations increased attacks targeting Polish government infrastructure by 300% in the last week. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Whether that larger purpose is genuine preparation for conflict or elaborate coercion designed to extract concessions remains unclear. But NATO isn't waiting to find out. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing a limited military operation designed to test NATO's Article 5 commitment without triggering full-scale war. Another is that Moscow is attempting to create a crisis that forces diplomatic negotiations on terms favorable to Russian interests. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to establish a new military fait accompli before Western political transitions create windows of uncertainty. But today, Poland took that card off the table. They didn't wait for Allied consensus. They didn't defer to diplomatic processes. They didn't hope that restraint would be reciprocated. They deployed forces in strength and demonstrated that any Russian advance would face immediate resistance. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see whether NATO's unity can be fractured through pressure. Poland wants to show that eastern flank nations will defend themselves with or without immediate Allied support. Brussels wants to prevent any miscalculation that could trigger Article 5 obligations. And Washington wants to prevent a second major land war in Europe while managing existing global commitments. The next 72 hours will determine whether this crisis escalates or stabilizes. Tonight, we've heard from NATO intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian forces on an hour-by-hour basis. They say Russian repositioning appears to have paused following Poland's response. They say electronic communications from Russian Western Military District have decreased significantly since this morning, and they say Moscow's decision to deploy strategic assets to Kaliningrad is likely part of a broader intimidation strategy intended to fracture Allied consensus before upcoming NATO summits. But Poland is not backing down. In fact, Poland is accelerating defensive preparations. Their response today, rapid, comprehensive, and unmistakably serious, sent a message to Moscow that coercion will not work, and it sent a message to Brussels that the eastern flank is ready to fight. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Moscow hoped to achieve with its midnight repositioning. But what we do know is that Brussels' warning was timely. It unified Allied messaging within hours. It provided diplomatic cover for Poland's defensive response, and it reminded Moscow that NATO remains committed to collective defense. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next several days. If they de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as another failed Russian probe. If they escalate further, Poland and NATO have already shown they are prepared to respond in kind. They have shown they are ready to defend every inch of Allied territory. And tonight, for the first time in months, Moscow appears to be reconsidering. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Russia is quiet after a probe meets resistance, it means they are recalculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Moscow learned something they have learned many times before, but seem determined to forget. NATO will not fracture under pressure. Poland will not be intimidated, and the alliance remains prepared to defend itself. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Russia's midnight move did not achieve its objectives. Brussels' warning was heard across the continent, and Poland stands ready tonight and every night that follows. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.